They called it justice, but if you were summoned before a medieval court, justice didn't wear a blindfold. It wore iron shackles and smelled of damp stone. In the great cathedrals and shadowed dungeons of Europe, where faith and fear walked hand in hand, a darker system governed the truth. You didn't speak it, it was torn from you. In those forgotten corridors beneath castles and towers, the human body wasn't a temple. It was an instrument, tuned, stretched, and shattered to produce a confession, whether true or not. In the name of divine order, the rack, simple in appearance yet devastating in function, became the star performer of this grim theater. A rectangular wooden frame equipped with rollers at each end, bound wrists, bound ankles. Ropes threaded like a loom, except this machine didn't weave fabric and unraveled people. With a slow, deliberate turn of the crank, the limbs were pulled in opposite directions, joint by joint, inch by inch. What began as tension escalated into something unspeakable. Shoulders popped first, echoing through the chamber like macabre percussion, then elbows, knees, hips, until the body, unnaturally elongated, trembled at. The very limits of anatomy. Medieval torturers referred to this ritual as an examination, as if truth were hiding somewhere deep in the marrow, and all it took to coax it out was a little persuasion, a lot of screaming. In a time before anesthesia, before human rights, before anyone thought to question authority, the rack was the purest expression of sanctioned agony. It didn't just inflict pain, it created a spectacle, and its silence, when it came, meant either a confession or death. There are documented cases of victims growing 6 inches taller during a session. Height is an unfortunate side effect of systemic trauma, a medieval miracle, perhaps, for those who survived. Although if you ever walked again, the damage was permanent. Dislocated joints, ruptured muscles, nerve endings screaming into voids. Some victims spent the rest of their lives twisted, a walking testimony to a justice system that cared less for evidence than it did for obedience. Yet, the rack was only the beginning. Beneath the Tower of London, another sibling of suffering awaited, the scavenger's daughter. A cruel irony in name alone, for while the rack pulled you apart, this device crushed you together. Invented by Sir Leonard Skeffington, its metallic embrace forced the victim into a crouching position so tight, they were folded in upon themselves, head pressed to knees, arms locked around chins. It was a hug, reimagined by someone who had long forgotten what affection felt like. Screws were tightened, bands constricted, and slowly, systematically, the body caved inward. Blood began to leak from the nose, ears, and even the fingertips. The organs weren't pierced. They were compressed. This was not a sudden death, a meditation on pressure, on space, on suffering without spectacle. The irony, it was efficient, compact, quiet. You didn't need a grand dungeon, just a corner, just a chair, just enough time. This was torture for bureaucrats, justice on a budget, a full body prayer. Folded into submission, its hymns replaced with sobs. In the 16th century, Catholic priests accused of defying England's Protestant Reformation were routinely folded into this metallic womb. One priest wrote that it felt like being bound into a book of prayers, but no one was listening. Then came the Iron Maiden, infamous, symbolic, possibly more myth than tool, and yet its legend speaks to something undeniably real. Imagine a tall, coffin-like cabinet, human-shaped, spikes line its interior, dozens, maybe hundreds. Designed, supposedly, not to kill, but to keep you alive long enough. A few inches of iron penetrating the chest, thighs, cheeks, carefully avoiding. Arteries, precision pain, a sculpture of agony. They say the first Iron Maiden stood in Nuremberg. 7 feet of ornamental horror. Outside, a face of peace carved to resemble the Virgin Mary. Inside, betrayal, steel teeth, a grotesque parody of sanctity. Before being placed inside, prisoners were shown the device, a preview. Anticipation became its own form of psychological torment. You didn't need to be pierced to break. You only needed to imagine it. The irony was layered. A sacred shape, a maternal name, an embrace that destroyed, and in this way, the Iron Maiden became not just a device, but a philosophy. It was the message beneath the message. What protects you can also consume you. Still, if you think this theater of horror peaked with the spectacle of spikes, think again. Because sometimes, what hurt the most was what could be carried in a pocket. The pair of anguish, deceptively simple, elegantly cruel, a small metal bowl, split into 4 segments, controlled by a screw. When turned, it expanded like a blooming flower, except this flower was inserted into the mouth, the anus, or the vagina, depending on your alleged crime. Blasphemy, sodomy, witchcraft. Each had its own pair, one for each orifice, tailored torture. Craftsmen built them with astonishing precision. Some could expand gradually, others explosively. And while there's debate among historians about the pair's actual use, whether it was ceremonial or practical, there's no question that it was made, and that it was designed with purpose. Court ledgers from the Spanish Inquisition list pairs with item numbers, repair dates, and efficacy notes. There were upgrades, versions that could be heated, ones engraved with religious symbols, custom. models for noble families. Some even came with gem-studded handles and perfume-carrying cases. Because even cruelty, it seemed, could be accessorized. The real horror. The silence. The pair left no external wounds. It damaged you from within. It ruptured the soft, hidden parts of the body. It transformed your breath into fire, your scream into blood. And when it was removed, the damage lingered, internal, bleeding, collapsed organs. Shame died in a world obsessed with confession. This was the scalpel to the rack's hammer, quiet, intimate, impossible to forget. But what made these devices more than instruments of pain was the ritual. Each one came with its own choreography, its own myth. Torturers had scripts, victims had roles, and every confession became a kind of performance, designed not to uncover truth, but to reinforce the power of the ones asking the questions. The Catherine Wheel, named after a saint who supposedly broke the device with her sanctity alone, offered a spectacle for the crowd. 8 feet of iron-bound wood, spikes arranged like the hands of a clock. Victims were tied to it, limbs threaded between the spokes. Then the bones were shattered, methodically, ceremonially, one limb at a time. Each crack a note in a symphony of submission. Executioners developed styles, techniques. They debated the optimal number of blows. Some kept logs, one even called his hammer St. Peter. This wasn't interrogation, it was choreography. A brutal ballet of bone and blood. Executions were scheduled for market days. Food vendors circled the crowd, children watched. The wheel wasn't just a tool, it was a message. This is what happens when you forget your place. Not every dungeon had a rack. Not every chamber needed an Iron Maiden. Some truths were extracted with tools that looked more like farming equipment than instruments of confession. The thumb screw, simple, efficient, a wooden or metal frame, small enough to fit in one hand. Inside, a pair of iron bars and a screw mechanism. The victim's thumbs or toes or fingers were placed between the bars. Then, the screw turned, one click at a time. The bone didn't shatter instantly. It was compressed, slowly, cruelly. Skin tore, tendons snapped, blood oozed through nail beds. Pain flooded upward like electricity with nowhere to escape. Sometimes fingernails would pop off with a sound like breaking twigs. It was intimate torture. No stage, no spectacle, just a man with the question and another man whose bones held the answer. This was the genius of medieval cruelty. It didn't require technology, just imagination, because torture wasn't just about pain, it was about time. Waiting, the pause between the turning of a screw. You never knew when it would stop. You only knew it could always go further. But what if the body was not enough? What if it wasn't the flesh that needed breaking, but the soul? Inquisition courts developed methods of psychological destruction, rituals designed to make you break yourself. Victims were kept in absolute silence, no windows, no voices, no names. In pitch-dark rooms, days passed like centuries. You forgot your language, your identity. By the time the interrogator returned, you weren't defending your truth, you were begging for someone to tell you what was real. Sleep deprivation, water starvation, hallucinogenic herbs. They didn't need to beat you to extract confession. They just made you forget who you were. Monks referred to it as the inward chamber, a place where man meets God by losing himself. But what kind of God waits inside a cell without light? In Spain and Italy, these techniques were elevated into ritual. Prisoners were brought before carved altars, half-drugged, half-starved. They were shown holy relics and asked to swear oaths in Latin. They no longer understood. Every false answer was proof of guilt. Sometimes they weren't even asked questions, just observed. How long they could stand. How still they remained while a candle burned down. Truth measured not by words, but by obedience. This wasn't torture. This was purification. But what about the branding irons? What about the devices that marked truth on no skin, made belief visible? In parts of Germany and Bohemia, heretics were branded with iron crosses on the chest. Witches received inverted stars. The marks weren't meant to punish, they were warnings. They told the world, this person has seen the dungeon and lived. Imagine the psychology. You walk free, but your body still confesses. You try to deny the charges, but the burn on your skin whispers otherwise. In some cities, victims were forced to carry the device that broke them, the rack's crank, the screw handle, the blood-stained rope out like a relic, a souvenir of obedience. But what if pain wasn't enough? What if shame was the real tool? The heretic's fork was nothing more than a short iron rod with 2 sharp prongs at each end. One end pressed under the chin, the other against the chest. The neck was stretched just enough that if the victim's head drooped, even slightly, the fork would pierce their throat or breast. No movement, no sleep, no prayer. The prisoner was forced to stand for hours, sometimes days, in this position. And if they collapsed from exhaustion, the fork did the rest. This wasn't execution, it was instruction. You learned quickly what could be spoken and what must remain buried inside. And buried it stayed, because not all torture left wounds. The strapado looked deceptively innocent, a rope tied to the wrists, thrown over a ceiling beam. The victim was hoisted into the air, arms bound behind their back. and then drop. Not to the ground, just enough for the arms to violently wrench. Upward, the shoulders dislocated instantly. Sometimes, tendons tore so loudly they echoed like gunfire. Then the process was repeated. Hoist, drop, rip, scream, in between. Silence. That was the real method. The suspense between movements, the unknown duration, the cause of medieval torture. Hope was a weapon. To and then there was water. Not the kind you drink. The kind that drowns you, without ever touching your lungs. The water cure, they called it. A funnel forced into the mouth, liters of water poured in. The stomach expanded, the body convulsed. It wasn't waterboarding, it was drowning from the inside. The organs screamed, the belly swelled grotesquely, and if the interrogators were kind, they'd bind the abdomen to prevent it from bursting. Not out of mercy, but so they could do it again tomorrow. Confessions extracted underwater were called baptisms of truth, as if pain had washed the soul clean enough to speak. This wasn't chaos. This was a system, one where pain became language, bones became books, and the dungeon, a chapel of forced revelation. But here's the question, if these confessions were extracted under torment, if the body was broken and the mind shattered, how much of that truth was real? That's what haunts historians. That's what makes medieval torture not just terrifying, but tragic. Because the devices didn't just destroy flesh, they destroyed records, they erased stories, they silenced lives. Every crank of the rack erased one more name. Every drop of the strap auto buried a memory, and in their place, lies, fabricated truths. Sign under agony. This wasn't justice. This was theater, and the audience was God. The iron doors are rusted shut now. The chambers are empty. The ropes have rotted, and the bloodstains faded. But the dungeon still breathes. Beneath the cobblestones of Europe's oldest cities, the past isn't dead, it's just silent. What happens to a society that builds truth on pain? That decides confession is not a right, but a requirement. That truth must be extracted rather than revealed. We inherited more than castles and cathedrals from the Middle Ages. We inherited their systems, their logic, their belief that truth is something that can be beaten out of a man, even now. Echoes remain. The architecture of modern prisons, the solitary cells, the windowless corridors. They mimic the same principles. Isolate, dehumanize. Erase identity. The interrogation methods used during global conflicts, sensory deprivation, sleep manipulation, simulated drowning. These aren't modern innovations. They're medieval rituals dressed in clinical language. We just changed the robes. We traded blood-soaked tunics for lab coats, but the questions are the same. Who are you? What do you know? And what are you willing to suffer to keep it? But why? Did torture flourish so deeply in the medieval mind? Because the soul mattered more than the body. And if pain could purify the soul, then the body was just a gate to break through. The logic wasn't cruelty, it was salvation. They believed they were saving you, even as they dislocated your shoulders. They believed they were helping you, even as the iron pressed into your flesh. It's easy to label them monsters, but monsters don't pray after a confession. Monsters don't build chapels above dungeons. Men did this. Without men, educated. Men with purpose. That's the true horror. Because it wasn't madness, it was method. A theology of pain, a science of obedience, a philosophy where suffering equals truth. And the victims, most of them didn't scream for freedom. They screamed to agree, to be told they were right, or forgiven, or real. Imagine the silence that followed a false confession. The torchlight dimmed. The door creaked shut, and you were alone. Again, you had spoken the words they wanted. But now, who were you? A traitor? A heretic? A liar? Or just one more broken instrument in a system that only heard truth when it echoed through pain? And here's the final cruelty. The torment didn't end in the dungeon. The body healed. Sometimes. The scars faded, eventually. But the mind remembered. Some never slept again. Some wandered towns, barefoot and shaking, whispering their own names like prayers. Others wrote down every detail, as if documenting the pain could keep it from vanishing. And sometimes they were believed. Sometimes they were burned anyway. Because medieval Europe didn't need truth. It needed compliance. If you died compliant, well, then you died saved. Today, tourists walk through these places. They take pictures beside racks and iron chairs. They laugh, sometimes, or shudder, but they rarely listen. They don't hear what the walls are still trying to say. Not all knowledge was written in books. Some truths were carved into bone, etched in fire, preserved not in parchment, but in pain. The medieval dungeon was never just a prison. It was a mirror. It showed Europe what it truly believed. That truth has a cost, and that cost is suffering. So ask yourself, if you had been there, down in the dark, when the door locked and the torch dimmed and the first question came in a voice you could barely hear, would you have told the truth? Or would you have told them exactly what they wanted to hear? Asterisk, they silenced the screams, but the truth still echoes. Beneath the stone asterisk like, share, subscribe, before they erase it again.